So yeah, I guess I want to start also acknowledging that I am a settler and a visitor to the unceded Malahat territory. And I think it's really important that in our discussions we really center ideas around environmental justice and social justice. And a huge part of that is acknowledging Indigenous sovereignty, acknowledging Aboriginal rights and titles. The fossil fuel industry in Canada has a long history of colonial exploitation and really using that to justify, using fossil fuel projects to justify the dispossession of land and resources from Indigenous communities. And so it's incredibly important that throughout our work that we keep that at the forefront. And I don't think that things can shift environmentally in Canada until we really come to terms with the ongoing colonialism that is happening, the ongoing colonization. So I'm here to talk a little bit about the divestment movement. And so it's divestment from fossil fuels. Chris introduced me. I'm the co-chair of Divest Victoria, and I also instruct in social justice studies and political sociology. And the divestment movement, kind of as a whole globally, is really about taking money out of fossil fuel companies and moving it into socially responsible investments. And it has two parts. So it's modeled after other successful divestment campaigns. The one that comes immediately to mind is the anti-apartheid movement, trying to stop apartheid in South Africa. And so, like the anti-apartheid divestment movement, fossil fuel divestment has two levels, and one is the kind of obvious one, which is that it moves vast sums of money out of fossil fuel companies, and so it has this financial clout. And I'm gonna talk a little bit more about the details of that financial clout. But the second level, and this is where I think the divestment movement has the most power, is the narrative, the ethical aspect of it. And it's really about holding the fossil fuel industry to account for its culpability in climate change and really its responsibility. And so both our government and the fossil fuel industry have a duty to respond to climate change and environmental injustice. I'm gonna put a few random hashtags and things that you can look up, although it looks like a few of them have gotten a little bit mixed up on this screen. So I'm talking about the global movement, and this movement really started as a, so it started fairly recently and has gained an amazing amount of momentum. So last September, there was about $50 billion committed to divestment, and they made the global divestment movement made a pretty ambitious goal to triple that. So they wanted to get to $150 billion by the Paris climate negotiations. And fast forward to right now, we are in the Paris climate negotiations, and they actually got to $3.4 trillion. That's 68 times what we were at last year in September. So they aimed for 3 times, achieved 68 times. So this movement has been wildly successful. And I think some of the reasons for that I've just put up here is it has a really strong financial argument. It calls into question the social license, has a variety of diverse supporters, has local and global connections, and it focuses on clean energy solutions. So that first one, the strong financial argument, is that as scientists are telling us more and more, we need to leave 2/3 of the known carbon, the known fossil fuel reserves in the ground if we don't want to get to catastrophic climate change. Fossil fuel companies value their assets as if we could burn them all. And so people invested in the fossil fuel industry at some point as climate regulations get stricter, as we start to realize we can't burn all of that fossil fuel without destroying ourselves and our planet, we're gonna have what is called stranded assets. So if your money is left in fossil fuel companies, you're not gonna get a return on those investments. So a very strong financial argument. Calls into question the social license, and so that's that ethical narrative part, really addressing the impacts of climate change and putting the fossil fuel industry to account for that. The variety of supporters is really Initially, this was started by climate activists, started on university campuses in the US, and it's changed drastically in the last year. Now 95% of the institutions and organizations that have committed to divestment are actually private companies like insurance companies and large, massive pension funds. So diverse people are coming behind this. Some of the more famous people who have spoken out in favor of fossil fuel divestment are Obama, Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the UN, the President of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the President of the World Bank, along with a number of kind of more pop star type people, as well as Naomi Klein, tons of climate activists. The next one is around the local and global, and so specifically tying these kind of local campaigns to the global campaign. And the fossil fuel divestment movement has done this really well. And then the last piece is focusing on clean energy solutions. So fossil fuel divestment is, on the one hand, taking your money out of fossil fuel companies, but it's also encouraging people to redirect that into socially responsible investments and to support climate solutions and clean energy solutions. I'm going to come back to this and link it to LNG. So I'll bring this kind of list of 5 things back up. And I just want to, so this movement has been wildly successful, and it's very easy for a big movement like this to kind of overshadow some of the more direct action that's happening to stop fossil fuel companies and projects. And so I want us to kind of make sure that we always have in our mind that fossil fuel divestment is a tool, and really climate justice is our goal. And so we want social justice, environmental justice, and economic justice. And unfortunately, the screen has shifted, so it's messed up the words a little bit, but I think you get the point. So that's the global movement. And then locally in Victoria, we have also had a lot of momentum, albeit on a smaller scale. And some of the things that have happened, we had our very first meeting in March of this year, and in that short time, just a few months, we organized a rally, we met with city councillors, we met with the mayor, and we actually passed a motion taking the first steps towards fossil fuel divestment. And that involves finding out what we can do as a city, what are the challenges and obstacles, as well as writing to the MFA, the Municipal Pension Plan, and the provincial government to find options. And we've got a bunch of things coming up in the future, including a motion to address day-to-day banking and put a screen on them for that, and getting the MFA and the MPP, the Municipal Pension Plan, to divest, which are longer-term goals. So how does this all connect to LNG? On the one hand, LNG in BC is kind of a perfect example of what we want to address in the fossil fuel divestment movement. Really, the goal here is to really have the fossil fuel industry and government held responsible for their impacts on climate change and environmental injustice. Also, we want to put pressure in a way that breaks the hold that the fossil fuel industry has on our governments and our economy. And so when we're thinking about the kind of hold that the government has, or the fossil fuel industry has on our government, LNG in BC is just the most perfect example. So Encana, which is a fossil fuel, it's a LNG company, donated over $1 million in the past 10 years to the BC Liberals. Huge amounts of money. Their founder, one of their founders, Gwyn Morgan, he and his wife have personally donated over $175,000 to the BC Liberals, and Gwyn is also now a personal advisor to Christy Clark. So we can see the kind of hold that this industry has on our provincial government. And then when we think about the impacts of the LNG industry, and those include fracking, poisoning of aquifers, building pipelines through unceded territory. When we think about the Saanich Inlet, that includes, an underwater pipeline, LNG tanker traffic through those waters, and then an export terminal. And so I just found this out, but that export terminal requires them to cool LNG, so liquefied natural gas, to minus 160 degrees. And in order to do that, they use ocean water to cool it. So they're bringing in tons and tons of water. So in Australia, export terminal that is half the size of the one that's proposed at the Malahat Steelhead project requires, it's 50,000 tons per hour. I just wanted to let that sink in for a second. 50,000 tons of water per hour. That means it's being heated and chemicals being added so that it doesn't gunk up the machine and then put back out into the Saanich Inlet. You can imagine in an inlet that is partially enclosed what that will do to marine life and coastal communities. I just can't emphasize enough the impact that this project will have. And I could go on, but I'm gonna leave that. But I do want to kind of emphasize the importance of naming the impacts, holding these industries to account for the impacts that they're having on communities from the very beginning to the end, including the kind of unreported methane emissions. So Christy Clark likes to call LNG the cleanest fossil fuel, but research coming out of Cornell University is saying actually, if you look at the methane emissions, LNG from kind of start to finish is worse than, or as bad or worse than coal. So this is not a clean energy option. So I told you I was going to come back to these kind of 5 points of why the divestment movement has been so successful and how that could relate to stopping LNG. So on the one hand, LNG is this perfect example of how the fossil fuel industry has a hold on our government. And on the other hand, the movement to stop LNG in BC can also be framed in terms of these really successful tactics. And so the first one is the strong financial argument. Next is calling into question social license, variety of supporters, local and global connections, and then focusing on clean energy solutions. I'm not going to go into depth in any of these, but just for that strong financial argument, I know Adam is going to talk more about this, but just on a basic level, right now, the cost of LNG is, the last time I checked, it was $7.30 per million British thermal unit. It costs $12 per million British thermal unit to produce. So you can just, by numbers, if it costs $12 and the price of it is $7.30, and people continually say that it's actually just going to go down and down because there's this excess of LNG production in the US and around the world. And so it doesn't make financial sense. Calling into question the social license, so some of those impacts that I talked about, and then also this idea of clean LNG. So really calling into question, are communities consenting to this? Are First Nations communities whose land these projects are on, and all of the First Nations communities affected, consenting? Variety of supporters and local and global connections. So I've put a bunch of pictures up here, and some of them are kind of pointing to this more global anti-fracking movement. The one up in the corner that says "Stop, no access without consent" is from the road into Unistoten camp. What I want for us is that everyone interested in stopping irresponsible fossil fuel extraction and transport to really create networks and connections. Down in the corner, I'm sure you'll recognize the Save Shawnigan water. As I'm sure you all know, there is a toxic soil dump and a lot of people who have been working so hard to stop it. And so I want to encourage you to make connections, support those people. I'm sure a lot of you have already been out there supporting, but as much as we can, giving emotional support, childcare, really reaching out and creating resilient communities so that we can actually continue and sustainably fight these projects. I have My Sea to Sky and Fractured Land really just pointing to this idea of making connections up north to similar stopping LNG fights. And Divest for Our Future, so connecting with people who are also interested in stopping irresponsible fossil fuel extraction. And the last piece is focused on clean energy solutions, and I'm not going to go into this too much because I know Guy is also going to really go into depth on this. But I wanted to point towards this because stopping LNG in BC isn't anti-development, it isn't anti-energy. It's really about having creative solutions, having environmentally responsible and sustainable solutions, creating a world that we want, one that is equitable, one that is sustainable, one that is socially just. And whenever I give a presentation like this, I know there's a ton of information, and I want to kind of leave people with something that they can do. And so I usually put up this kind of 5 and 5, which is 5 things you can do in less than 5 minutes. Now, if you follow through on some of them, they might take a little bit longer, but just right now, less than 5 minutes, you could write down the name of one friend or family member who you're going to talk to about this LNG project, specifically the Malahat LNG project, and some of the things that you are going to hear tonight. Write down the name of one media outlet and one politician that you're going to contact about this LNG project. The third one is really something that I would love if you did, which is to visit Divest Victoria, like Divest Victoria on Facebook, and follow Divest Victoria on Twitter. I want us to be connected with communities who are fighting LNG projects, and the more that we can create these networks of connection. I teach social movements at the University of Victoria, and social movements aren't just about protesting, aren't just about advocating to our government. It's also about building networks of connections, building a movement, really. And so the more we can do that, the better. And then look up or donate to LNG direct action campaigns. And some of the ones that you can look up are Una Stoughton Camp, Lilu Island. You'll hear a little bit more about that later tonight. And then tell someone about which of these you will do or that you do. And so really, I find that part of the reason I tell people about the things that I'm committing to is it helps me remember and follow through, but it also can spark them creating their own list of things that they're going to do around this issue as well. So either tell people about what you're going to do, or once you've done it, tell someone about what you did. So yeah, just as a last thing before I pass on the mic, what I'd love for you to take away from this is, first of all, the global divestment campaign has been wildly successful, and it's a tool. And it's a tool for climate justice. It's a tool for environmental justice, and it's only as successful as it accomplishes that goal. I also want us to be aware of the impacts of these projects and really create strong networks of connection between organizations, between communities, between the people within our communities. And then lastly, it's really this envisioning a future that we want. And so the future that I'm envisioning is one that is equitable, that is environmentally sustainable, and that is socially just. Thank you very much.